Good morning. Ayin Beis, volume 3. We are on page 1391. We finished the paragraph on page 1391. To sum up is we're middle of a very, I would say, almost condensed and very concise version of bringing into many different paradigms, if you wish, to explain the idea of Beriyah and Yetzirah, which began with Talmud and Mishnah, where one is a state of concealment and one is a state of revelation, but the quality that he's focusing on here is the virtue of something revealed. So though Beriyah is higher than Yetzirah, but things are still either concealed, Beirach Cheshech, dark, concealed, the state of a unshaped yesh that's not yet been defined because it's still closer to the ayin, and Yetzirah, Yetzirah, light, which by definition is revelation. And the Rebbe Rashab explained that these, he began with saying lahoyer, yesh lahoyer, meaning we can comment and on this, comparing it to Iggulim and Yosher, with Iggulim being a higher energy, but it's makif. It's surrounded, it's above, it's not as revealed and internalized and integrated. And Yosher integrated, that's why Yosher is Ruach, which is higher than Iggulim, which manifests as Nefesh. It's also the difference between, as I said, Beriyah, Yetzirah, Tohu, this is the difference between Tohu and Vayhu, he said, as well as let's just see, I'll go through all the different elements that he brought. The Tagin and the Asius, the crowns on the letters and the letters. Just going over this briefly. Binah and Midas. So Binah, even though Binah compared to Chochma is already something internalized, but it's still in the mind. And emotions is where it plays itself out, the birthing of the emotions. So Binah and Zah, which is the difference between these two levels as well. One is makif, Binah is makif to Zah, so it's all relative. Then on a higher level, he brought the Tzchayim that this is the difference between the two levels in Keser. Atik being a higher level, Atik is a place of what he's going to say soon, completely unknown, Ephes, that we can't have any grasp in it, and Arich or Arich Ampin is already the beginning of the Sheresh, the root of the emanations. So though it's not Chochma Gluya, it's not conscious Chochma, but it has super conscious Chochma. So it's the beginning. So you call that the level of that relates. So it's still concealed, but not completely concealed. And he explained that is the difference between that's why it's called Tohu. So Ephes, the higher level of Keser, is not even Tohu yet. Tohu means there's something there, but it's not clear what it is. It's confusing, it's bewildering. Like he said, Binah, Mikaima L'Shaila. Binah is called me. Me means what? Me. Who? In other words, you have a question. That means there's something that you know, but you don't know. You know enough to ask the question. So the Kaima L'Shaila, it's subject to a question. The loy, they're not to be known. So that means there's a knowledge, but it's a knowledge that he calls Yediyas HaMetzias. You know of its existence. It's similar to what we spoke about Beriyah earlier, Yediyas HaMetzias, that Chacham Adaf Menavi, that there's you know about it, about a deeper level, but you don't know its Mahus, its personality. So that's all the level of Binah, of Beriyah, or what he's calling here in Keser, that is the level of Arich. Then there's a higher level. So, which is so that's called Seichel Nelam. The higher level is Radla and Atik, which is called Seichel Mufla. That's completely unknown. There we have no grasp at all. Okay. And then the final piece we learned on page 1391 is that the pardas that says that Yediyas Chachmase Binase is like Yediyas Atzmuse Yisbarach, which means that Chochma and Binah are giving us some sense of what God is like, even though it's not a full sense, but something. That's why in some way it eludes us. But on the other hand, we can relate to it to some extent. Midas, on the other hand, based on that, is far more integrated, where we can relate to much more directly. It doesn't remain elusive like the question that Binah poses, Kaima l'shayla. In the parentheses, the Rebbe Rashab said in Tanya, in Shayuchad V'Amunah, he says clearly, just like as Chochma and Binah are connected with the Atzmus, also Midesav, God's also emotions and attributes are also connected, which would seem to contradict what we just said, that Midas are more relate to us, and Chochma Binah more relate to the divine. So he says that's not the case. The reason is, in other words, so the Shaykh V'Amunah breaks it down further. The Pardes, where the Rebbe Rashab says he did not find it yet in the Pardes, but apparently the Pardes separates between the two, where Shaykh V'Amunah equates Moichin and Midas. But yet the Rebbe Rashab does reconcile it, because Efsher, that's because Moichin is the level of Oyer, Iyu v'chayu yichad, and Midas is the level of Garmuhi. And then he finally brings, so that would mean that there is something in common among them. They're both Elikus in Atzilus, and both ultimately an expression of the divine, but one is a far deeper level of unity, as I discussed yesterday, that the mind ultimately takes us into God's mind, where God's emotions or God's attributes, we become beneficiaries of God's chesed. But it's not quite like understanding how God thinks, so to speak. So it's like going more into the engine room, or into the, lack of a better word, a CAT scan of God's mind and inner workings, which is what Chochma and Binah do. And then finally, the Eitz Chaim says that Binah sometimes is referred to Garmuhi, which he's calling here Midas, because Binah compared to Chochma also can be distinguished. So bottom line is, all of Atzilus is a divine experience. The difference is the level of that divine. In the interface context, Chochma is the highest level, obviously, as it unifies itself with the superconscious. Binah is on the next level, but it still remains, compared to Midas, like a Shaila question, only Yediyas HaMetzias. So you have you're aware that something exists, but you don't know its personality. Midas is much more integrated. So even though they have something in common, but when you break it down, everything is relative compared to the level higher than it. And obviously, Keser has both. When you talk Keser, has the level of Ayin, the lower level of Keser Arich, which associates more like the Binah, that's a root of Binah, and Atik Radla, which is completely incomprehensible. That is Resha Delay Siyada, completely not graspable, what he called Ephes. But what you see here is something in common throughout Ayin Beis, that different levels, each one either is becoming more and more sublime, going upward as it becomes more divine, or is it manifesting also into our existence to some extent? But this is all in Atzilus. From Atzilus, then it will come into Beriyah and Yetzirah, with Beriyah manifesting more the Helam part, meaning the part that is what he called Tohu, like Binah, and Yetzirah manifesting the Midas Zah, which is more revealed and therefore more defined, as we've been learning. So that is the summary to the end of this paragraph. What I was going to add was some things that I said yesterday after we finished the class formally, was that still trying to fully translate this into the Talmud Mishnah discussion. So Mishnah clearly is the clarity that you have in Yetzirah that originates from Chagas of Atzilus. Remember the Midas of Atzilus, Chagas, Zah, nests in Yetzirah. So that's Mishnah. So it has the clarity that was received by Rabbeinu HaKadosh, the author of the Mishnah, as he received the generation, like we learned, where Chochma law is radiating in Chochma Tata, that the written Torah is radiating in the oral Torah, going back all the way to Moshe Rabbeinu. They had that clarity. That's the crystal clarity and the Maila of Yetzirah. On the other hand, Talmud is in a state of darkness when we don't fully have that clarity, but the human being, through our avodah, we can achieve it through our effort. And that's what Talmud is. It's coming in a state of darkness like moonlight. I should add, the Mishnah is more like the stones, the luminous stones that reflect the sun. The moonlight is coming in the night, and through our work, we're penetrating that darkness. And in order to do so, you have to go back and reach even deeper place than Zav Atzilus and even Chochma Binah Atzilus. all the way back to the Ayin of Keser that we learned, where the superconscious state, where it all originated from, where even Mikra originated from. As it was given from God to Moshe, Moshe had that access in other words, not just the written word, but where that written word is originated from. Like we learned Sefer, Sipur, becoming the Sefer, the Seferim, which are the Talmudic sages, are accessing the Sefer that is Moshe. When he wrote down the Torah, he had access from the superconscious part of Torah into the conscious part of Torah. So in a sense, in the state of darkness in Talmud, we're accessing even deeper levels. But Mishnah still has the quality that there is a clarity there, except some of us don't see it because we're living in a darker state, in a concealed state. So in a way, when we're struggling through our efforts, we're actually going back to the primordial state of Tohu, before, basically, let's call it the Big Bang, before it began to be shaped into Yetzirah, into Mishnah, to be able to counter the concealment in order to be able to understand the deeper meaning in the Mishnah that we don't have clarity in. So the darkness forces us, compels us to go deeper back to the roots of creation, essentially. Whereas Mishnah is the regular process of Mikra, Mishnah, Chabad, Chagas, revealed in Yetzirah. And Beriyah has that aspect that it's going deeper in, but remember, on its own, it's a dark state. So it requires this study and exertion. In other words, the Talmudic sages didn't come automatically. It came precisely because they were Moshe Nefesh, and they committed their lives with complete mysterious nefesh, complete dedication and devotion to draw out that clarity. That's how I would frame it, just to put it in that context. Okay. If anybody wants to ask anything, now is a fine time. But the next section is going to continue the discussion of me. Remember, me who's there, when you say, Su marim enechem, v'ru me. Who? Me is like who? Who goes there? Me who? Who is that? So it's a question. So like he said, that Binah has both elements. It's a question, meaning that it's something that is not fully understood. But on the other hand, there's enough for you to ask the question. That means there's something that you're aware of, or else you wouldn't ask who. Like if you're sitting in a dark room and somebody walks into the room, you say, who's going? You know there's someone in the room. The level of atik, you don't even ask who, because you're not even aware that something has happened. So he's going to elaborate on that in the next paragraph and continue this discussion. But again, let me stop if anybody wants to ask anything on what I've said or what we learned till here.
Fourth son, God is actually like atik. You can't even ask a question.
Well, higher than me, yeah, is like atik, exactly. But you see the importance of asking questions, because that's the way we grow. You know, an answer is already internalized, that we understand, that we get it. Then the question means there's still something above our head, so we climb further. And as we climb, then there are more horizons that open up. And that's the whole process of, ultimately, as we've talked about seeing God, you can't see God and live. Like we talked about the Rebbe's explanation, the Panim Yofis, that you could ultimately even see that, but you have to see it by not looking. But that's already, we'll talk about that more as we go to those higher levels. That's what we learned so far. Okay.
So Rabbi, real quick, question. So is the hasaga of the brooding to understand the depth of the Talmud versus the Mishnah, like connecting more to Tohu, ideally, because it's connected more through Binah and through the detail-oriented aspects of that connection? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'll give a simple example. A healthy person, where everything is functioning well in the human body, is healthy. There's no need to go ahead and dig into the deeper, let's call it stem cells, to create any form of healing or immunity or anything like that. God forbid, if something happens and something is not working properly, you need sometimes to go back into the root origins, or you can call the stem cells as one example, but it could be anything, because you need to stimulate something from the root. So in a way, once Tohu happened, remember, after Tohu came Vayhu, Yetzirah, And then came Asiya. We have a world. On day 1, light was created. Day 2, Rakia, etc. The human being is placed in the Garden of Eden. We have a complete world. Actually. It's a perfect world. And then the human being has to develop it further and make it grow. But what happens when there's a state of concealment, like after Chet Tzadas? Or even without the Chet Tzadas, just a state of concealment, but especially through the sin, we know the divine gets concealed. So now it's like an unhealthy organism. But not all is lost. Remember, the state of Tohu is still there in the background. The primordial state never really went away. It's just now been shaped and formed. So the raw clay, for example, is still there, even when you shape it into an ornament. But you don't have to access that so-called stem cell level. You don't have to access the level as it is in its origins because things are functioning. That's like Mishnah. But in a situation where there's a darkness and a concealment and we don't have clarity, so now you have to dig deeper and go back to the Tohu state, the primordial state before it was shaped, to be able to draw from there to find clarity even in a darker state. That's how, maybe I just another additional points to make this clear.
Thank you. Thank you, that was clear. Thank you.
I think the stem cell idea, actually, which I brought right now, just came to me, can be very well used as a Tohu type of state. Even though I don't know if a stem cell is like Tohu exactly, but it definitely is stem. Stem means at the root, at the origin of it. Yeah. I mean, you see this in many situations. I'm just trying to find other examples. In chemistry, for sure, biology, in science, where when something is blocked, you need to go back to the original place to like unclog it or something, or draw more energy from the source, because what you have right now is not adequate. Because let's say there's a drought, or there's a situation that things are not just flowing smoothly. So you need to go back to the mouth of the well, so to speak, to open it up and draw from there. Just, I mean, I'm sure there are many, many examples for this.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you.
But again, I want to just say, just because I'm trying to always be accurate, the Rebbe Rashab did not explicitly state, at least yet, that this is Mishnah and Talmud. I'm extrapolating and deriving it from earlier discussion and putting in the context of Beriyah Yetzirah here. Here, the focus is essentially the quality of Yetzirah, that even though it's a lower world, it's more revealed and integrated. But it's pretty clear that there is unbelievable power in Beriyah. I mean, remember, Beriyah is still a world, and it's still a world that precedes Yetzirah. It's just that Yetzirah has another level of assimilation or integration and so on. Okay. I'm also taking the liberty as well, because since now the Rebbe Rashab is introducing the concepts of Helam and levels of Ayin and Efes and 2 levels of Keser, so that really gives us the license to go back. Once the Rebbe Rashab has opened that door, so we can now go back to things that he discussed this at length in Volume 1 and in Volume 2, especially Volume 1, the 2 levels of Chochma Stima, Atik and Arich, because he's explicitly stated it. So there's only one reason he's explaining that. This is not a tangent, is because we're talking about accessing these higher levels, and there's always the give and take. Whatever, the higher it is, the less known it is, the less revealed it is. But on the other hand, when you work hard, you can draw that from there. The more revealed it is, not as high it is. But that's essentially the story of the interface. You want the highest levels of the divine to be integrated into our beings. And that's a constant dance, and that's why you need all these levels, as we discussed yesterday at length. The whole Seder Shtalshalos, all the elements and all the spheres are all really just stepping stones at the end of the day, with each stone, each stepping stone, each rung of the ladder, giving us a little more awareness of higher state of consciousness, higher state of godliness, with Moichin higher than Mides, Beriyah higher than, Beriyah and then Yetzirah and Asiya. So it's all really about this bridge that goes from Arimimcha Lekaya Melech down, from the top down through Torah, and Arimimcha Lekaya Melech from the bottom up through Tefillah. So this is really the story that you see it all really emerging here. The Rebbe Rashab is not making he's not specifically stating all the links, but when you learn all of Ayin Beis, it's very clear that this fits right into the whole general theme, and it's actually As I said, I would like to believe that the Rebbe Rashab had more time. He would have gone back and would have added much more, and we would have seen it explicitly. But I have no hesitation to say that it's pretty clear to me that this is the connection, even if the Rebbe Rashab doesn't specifically state it. I know I always emphasize that let's just stick to what he states clearly, but here there's no real choice because he's bringing the topic, but he's not saying this is that level, this is that level. So it's not a big jump to be able to make those connections. Okay. So let's continue on the new paragraph on page 1391. So he continued. Uba Pardis, so he's quoting the Pardis. The pages can be found at ayinbeis.com. Uba Pardis, now again, the Pardis is the Ramak, quoted already quite a few times. So he's bringing now new Pardis. B'shar Hashemis. Again, this, I just repeat this because to me it's a signpost. When the Rebbe Rashab starts throwing out all these marmakamis, these sources, you could see that the language and the tone of the mimer shifts a bit. It shifts into very grounded sources, not so much elaboration, but connections. But this happens, I recall at least 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 5, 6 times in Ayin Beis, where the Rebbe Rashab does this in a very elaborate way. He brings like many sources, 10, 20, 30, 40 sources. I remember in volume 1, I think I pointed it out there when we learned that there was one place I actually made a list. I want to just look at it because it was so fascinating to me. I actually counted 35 different sources in just a few pages to explain there. He was explaining actually something connected, being how Makif radiates into the immanent energy on Shabbos. So literally 35 different sources in just a few pages. So in other words, this is a certain style that the Rebbe Rashab from time to time reverts to, where he is like grounding it and also expanding the idea into many different paradigms and different idioms that are connected. So B'Pardish B'Shar Hashem is Perek Ches. So another Shar in Pardes is Shar Hashemis, which he talks about the names, the divine names. Chapter 8, Arich, he elaborates, Be'inyan zeh shabina nikra mi. So he made reference to it in the last paragraph. I mean, more than just reference. So there he elaborates on the fact that Binah is called me. So whenever you see the word me, like the classic is in the Zohar where he says, Su marim einechem uru'u mi bara ela. Raise your eyes to heaven and see who has created it all. So the Zohar says that me is referring to the level of Binah. In other words, it's a state of somewhat, I'd say, somewhat of awe even. Me, who? You're wondering. So he elaborates that what in this that Binah is called me, and the Rebbe Rashab is now going to cite some of that. The Kosav and the Pardes, the Ramak writes there, the mihu haskolas dover mashiyipol boy hashayla lemer mihu zeh. So the Ramak says like this: me is haskolas dover. It's the trying to understand an idea, and a question falls in. A question arises. Lemer, what is the question? In other words, you're learning an idea. Haskolas dover. In the process of learning, a question arises where you say, mihu zeh. What is this? So just like we're learning here right now, and you learn, let's say, the topic of Tohu and Vayu, and you ask, what is this exactly? That's part of the intellectual process. In other words, understanding an idea does not just mean resolving it. It's not just the clarity. Process of learning something is also asking, what is this? As a matter of fact, that's like the first step in any good class. Any good teacher is going to first introduce a topic and then say to the students, now my students, let's discover what is this? What are we being introduced to? So that's what the Ramak says. Again, mihu, because the me who haskolas dover ma is the understanding of any particular topic. Sheyipol b'hashayla lemer, where a question arises. In Hebrew, you say yipol means the question falls into the picture, but it means a question arises. Interesting, arise, lipel means fall and arise, but it's the same idea. Where a question emerges, Layman, mi who's that? V'zeu inyan mi. And that's the meaning, that's the idea of a me, that you're addressing an issue, you don't yet have an understanding of it, but the understanding enough to ask what? What is this? Or who? Even though you may not have, he doesn't say yet, but he says you don't have an answer to this question. So there, he's using the Ramak to describe exactly what he said earlier. When it comes to Radla, Reshad Yada Atik, you don't even ask that question. You're not in a place. You can't ask about something you're not aware of. If you remember earlier, I just want to quote a line. He said like this. We spoke about Binah. He says, Seichel mufla, hainu shemufla yediyah Yosher legamri, gam b'chinas Chochma la, aval b'chinas Arich neida mitziyusei al kapanim. By Arich, at least you know that it exists. It's like saying, my conscious mind has an idea. So you ask, where did the ideas come from? When I ask the question, where do conscious ideas come from? That's me. That's not reaching Seichel Mufla. That's Seichel Nelam. The Ubchinas Chochma Sman Nikas Seichel Nelam Sha'helam Yesh Le Shaychus Al Kaponim Al Agilui V'Gam Bchinas Helam U'Shi Yedim Al Kaponim Sheyesh Dover Anela. You at least have identified that there's something there, something behind the door, behind the curtain. The Ime Yesh She'enu Yedei Mahu. I'm reading earlier on, and even though you don't know what it is behind the curtain, how do you Yedei is Veis Shebehech Chechlem Sheyesh Dover Kazeshu Bchinas Helam. He knows it. And you have to say there's something there that's in a state of Helam. That means there has to be, at least you're aware that something is there. You can't call that total unawareness. You just don't know what it is because it's behind the curtain, it's concealed. However you explain it. So this is very consistent, what he said earlier, now using the words of the Pardes, that he says, but you're asking me, and it's part of the revelation of Askola's Dover. This is not part of concealment. It's concealed, but it's part of the process where you learn something, and then you come to a point where you ask, what is this? Or who is this? Ma is what, B is who. But it's a similar idea. I'm wondering whether
one second.
Say something. 1 second. Hold on a second. Me is saying is Binah. I know by ma, koyach ma of Chochma, mahu, that's by Chochma. So it could be ma is Chochma and me is Binah. I'm just throwing that out as a thought. I'm not sure. I don't know if he's going to even say it. And then there's Ephes, that's completely beyond. Yeah, what do you want to ask?
No, I just want to say, I was wondering why the same word me is used as who, what, and where. That's what you're similarly saying. In
Hebrew, what is ma? Where is another word? Where is not Ephah? No. No. Where are you getting that from? Ephes is not where. Why are you saying that?
Ephah.
Heichon is in Hebrew is where, or Ephah in more modern Hebrew. Ephah, Heichon. Ma is what and me is who. Who, what, where. Who, what, me, ma, and okay, it's fine. It's not relevant to our discussion. Fine. So that's the first quote from the Pardes. Remember, he said the Pardes Hirich. He elaborates about this. The Rebbe Rashab is only quoting some select citations from there. So he says like this: "V'kosav achakach." The Pardes writes afterwards, "The pirush omuk v'sosum." So he explains the words omuk, which means omuk means in deep down, deep. V'sosum means concealed or closed up. So when you say something is revealed, it's on the surface level. Say omuk v'sosum are two words used to describe something in the depths, something that is more submerged. Omuk v'sosum. So what does he write about omuk v'sosum? He writes like this: Kikfar nishave, because something was already created. Hainu sheyotza min ha'chochma. When you're dealing with Binah, something has already emerged. You can't say there's nothing there. Kikfar nishave, meaning Binah has already taken on shape, has developed. Hainu, the Rebbe Rashab adds, Sheyotza min ha-chochma, it's already emerged from Chochma, which was just a nakuda. Chochma is just a spark. Binah has developed into something. Omnom ha-havoya hi amuka b'bchinas ha-chochma. That's the words of the Pardes. Remember, the Pardes language is a certain type of language used. So I'm saying ha'avoya because even though it looks like havaya, but havoya means it's being, it's coming into being. You say something, the havoya of something comes into being. Hi amuka b'bchinas ha-chochma. It's buried like in the deep place in the level of chochma. Okay, so now he's adding, and the parentheses will explain it further. So he's explaining that Binah is already an emergence, but it's still deep and concealed. So when you say something is deep and concealed, even though it may be concealed from us, the observer or the recipient, but it doesn't mean that it's completely removed. It just means, like he said before, there's a question. But now he's explaining it more in terms of the very substance. What does Binah look like? So Binah is an entity. Remember, Tohu is also an entity, but it's an entity where we're puzzled. What is it? Because it's in such an amorphous state. Again, from the recipient's point of view. So he says now like this. So Havoyehi amuka b'bchinas ha-chochma. So kfar nesave, it did come into being, and meaning it went out of chochma, but it's still. Its existence is the depth within Chochma. What does that mean? So the Rebbe Rashab explains. The Mefarish, because the Pardes explains that me, hu b'ischabrus ha-Chochma. That me, Binah, is not just the level of Binah, it's Binah as it's attached to its source, which is Chochma. The ischabrus ha-Chochma ma Binah, I should read, rather. That me is referring to the attachment or the connection of Chochma im Binah with Binah. So it's not just Binah a standalone, it's Binah as it's attached to Chochma. You're talking about sources. Here goes another 3 that the Rebbe Rashab just throwing out there. Delve into what the Pardes writes in another shar. In Seder Atzilus chapter 5. Ayin Beis is Ayin Beis, and the Shara Esi is chapter 2. Ayin Beis Bolok Dafreish Dalet Omer Aleph. Look in the Zohar Bolok, page 204a. Ubemigdash Melech Sham, and the commentary called Migdash Melech on the Zohar. Now I didn't look it up, so I can't tell you what it says there, but clearly it probably elaborates on this level of me, how Binah and Chochma connect. So we know there's Chochma, there's Binah, but we know there's also Binah within Chochma, there's Chochma within Binah. We learned this. Havein b'chochma, chochem b'bina. But there's also where Binah and Chochma are connected still before Binah becomes a completely self-separated entity. And this is what me is. And that's why the Pardes says that even though Binah has already emerged, but it's still amuka b'bchinas ha-chochma. Its existence is still so-called buried within, in the level of Chochma. Because we're talking about the attachment of Chochma and Binah. What this is very reminiscent of, actually, if you may recall, a few pages back, and that's where I said we would do classes on this, where we brought the Pardes, the 6 different levels of how Keser turns into Chochma. You remember that piece? And we talked about how the superconscious turns into the conscious.
I was just going to ask you, the lowest part of the higher level.
That was on the page. That was on page, let me just explain 1 second before you say anything. That's on page 1381. So when I'm reading this, it sounds very much like he spoke there in all the spheres. There are 6 stages of how a higher sphere develops into a lower sphere. There he spoke primarily Chochma and Keser and Chochma. But he said it's also Chochma and Binah and so on. So I'm just looking there, what the source there, the Pardes there was Shar Gimel Perek Zayin. What are we talking now? Shar Hashemis. It's a different Shar. Shar page of this. That was a different Pardes. But then he brought another Pardes, if I recall. Hold on. Shar Hey Perek Hey. Okay. But anyway, a lot of Pardes that I just said that's very reminiscent of that process. So here he's talking about Chochma and Binah as the Binah is emerging. So something is emerged, but it still has that amok, the amok of the depth of, in other words, it's still submerged somewhat and buried or hidden within Chochma. However you translate, amuke b'bchinas ha'chochma, havoyehi amuke b'bchinas ha'chochma. Yeah, in other words, it's a Binah that's emerging, but it's still buried and submerged within Chochma. Okay.
Is it fair to say this is nascent Binah? Because we often talk about Binah as understanding, and here we're talking about Binah as like you're just beginning to understand and formulate just beginning to build out the concept. Like you cup it just a little bit, but you haven't quite cupped it entirely. So you ask a lot of questions to refine.
It could be, or it could be explained in different ways as well. It could be still a state that we don't yet feel it, but it's beginning to emerge. I mean, he doesn't say enough here to explain that. And the bottom line, it's a process. It's like asking a question when a seed begins to sprout. What stage is it? It depends. Day one, you just see a bit, and day two, a little more. I can't say what stage exactly this is because without further explanation, he doesn't explain it. He's just stating the level. But clearly, we know that something has emerged because he says that, not kfar nishava, but it's still in the state of amuka. Now, when we say, for example, me, a question, that's already you're learning something and you're asking, who is this? Or what level is this? So I can't really, I don't know if I can place exactly what level of this Binah is, whether it's nascent Binah, as you put it, or a little more, or a little less. It's definitely one of the stages there. But I'm not negating what you're saying is possible. Fine.
Binah is like a verb in this case, right?
What?
Binah, you say a process, it's like a verb. Binah is a place, but it's also sometimes like a verb, an action thing, a verb. Binah actions, which is either, like contemplation, beginning or questioning, contemplation, and then arguing. It's like all verbal.
Well, Binah is a process of understanding something. So there's always somewhat of a journey. You're talking about coming to a conclusion? Where you say this is the
not at all coming to a conclusion necessarily, but it acts like a verb. There's a place called Binah that we always think of it as a noun.
But that place,
like
who says a place can't be a verb? Who said the place is not a verb? Everything is in flux. I mean, why?
Normal English, which everything I
but this is not normal English, and we're not talking about stationary physical levels. We're talking about ethereal, spiritual levels, conceptual levels. So they are not exactly a place as in a particular shelf in your refrigerator. It's not in that sense at all. They're all in flux, in a process state. That's how I understand it. Okay. But he didn't finish. This is all still a quote from Pardes. So after the parentheses, this is called the level of the depths, plumbing the depths. Like when we speak about ma'amakim. So amokim is a level called the depths, not just depths. She'ozi stuma. Then Binah is still a state of stuma, means concealed, covered up. Sosu means hidden. Ein roi hanikra mokim she'ozi stuma, ein roi sheyikra b'shem hamachayiv b'inyan chiyuv klal hamagbel hadover b'geder inyan ma elami. Okay. So in that state of concealment, Binah, ein roi, it's not yet applicable, not fitting, and not possible to call it by a name. The shemachayiv, hamachayiv, a name, a defining name that compels a certain definition. Hamachayiv b'inyan chiyuv klal, saying that this is what it is. In other words, you have a definitive definition of what the idea is. Hamagbil hadover begeder inyan ma, that defines the idea, or gives it parameters in some fashion. Some geder is parameters. Inyan ma, elo is the level of me. Who? Still remains elusive. Who is this? So it's not defined in any particular way yet. So something has emerged, that's clear, but it's emerged in a way that remains concealed and in the depths of Chochma, which means it's not yet defined in any particular way. So based on this, you could say that Binah, this level of Binah, of me, is that you have an idea, and yet it remains still unclear of what exactly has been shaped here. Then there's, of course, going to be a level where it becomes shaped, and you have a fully defined idea with all its parameters. So here, this is a state where if there's something that to talk about. That's why you can't call it complete Ephes, but it's like what he calls Ayin, but it remains elusive in that sense that it's still me. At kan l'shene. Until here, that's the quote. The quote ends here. So this is an actual quote, the second quote. So he brought two quotes from the Pardes here. One is the idea of mihuzeh, the question, the process of understanding something. And now he explained it even more by saying that this is the level of omuk v'sosum. So you say something is deep, something is concealed, but there's a something that's concealed. So something has been delivered, but it's still concealed. That's what he just explained. Okay? And now the Rebbe Rashab is going to connect it back to what we've been learning. V'hainu, and this means kamay inyan hatoyu. This is like the inyan of toyu. This is exactly what was described toyu. Shenizbar li'il shelo yitztak b'shem. As we learned earlier, that there it's not appropriate, it's not fitting, not applicable to give it a name. That's why it's called toyu. Mata is b'nei adam, because you don't have yet a definition. That's the exact words he used 2 pages back from the Ramban. I'm just reading from there. What did he say about toyu? He said that toyu is of Shoyz HaMetzias. Chemer Yuli. Efshar lechanese b'shem b'nei she'enu b'chinas toyer v'tzir. You cannot define it by a name because it's still in that state. Yeah.
Right. That's literally like if you say what, like tohu what, then you know there's something what there, and you don't know what it is.
And what and who is the same thing for all practical purposes here.
Okay. But I'm saying you know what, there's something there, meaning there is a Metzias, but you don't know what it is. That's what you're, yeah, right? Like,
yeah, exactly.
Related to that. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Just clarifying.
Yeah. I just want to see a language that I remember before. I want to just get it. Amata b'nei Adam, yeah. Okay. Any questions? Oh, I see it's already. Oh, right. Any questions? I want to point out that remember the Rebbe Rashab did not break this third part of Ayin Beis into paragraphs. The paragraphs were done by the people who prepared for publication. So the paragraphs can be a little deceptive. Like I, for example, would break the paragraphs a little differently here. Because the Pardes is really a continuation of what he said before. And then, Ulefize Yitakan Leimer, the next line we're going to be learning, maybe tomorrow, is really going back to what, if you remember, I also pointed out that the Yesh Lahoyer, the third line in the previous paragraph on previous page, I would have made that the beginning of a paragraph. And then maybe continued here. So just for the record, if you're looking at the paragraphs as definitive indications of a beginning of a subject, it's not necessarily the case. They're not always in my opinion, at least, accurate. As I said, they were made by the people who prepared it. Okay. But let me just see here how far we should go. Well, we'll stop here. I will just give a little preview. The next line is going to go back and say, so now remember we began this whole topic of Iggulim v'Yosher, v'yesh lahoyer, the third line of the paragraph on page 1390. So now he's going to say, Lefizeh, now we can say that Beriyah Yetzirah, coming back to the theme of Beriyah Yetzirah, that is like makif and primi, Iggulim v'Yosher, Tohu and Vayu. So you know what? I'll read 3 lines. I will read till the parentheses. And based on this that we just discussed at length, or relatively the last page, Yatak and Lamer, you can say, it's fitting to say, in the levels of Beriyah Yetzirah that we've been discussing earlier, that's like makif, a transcendent energy, pnimi, an immanent energy, like we said, the circles and the line. The Iggulim ubchinas helam. Iggulim, the circles, the makif is a state of concealment. Like we just said, the level of Binah, the level of Tohu. So something is there, but it's still an amorphous state. The Yosher ubchinas gili. And Yosher is the level of gili. Ukamoy kain. And so too, b'chinas habriyah hanikra Tohu. Ukamoy b'chinas Arich. Shubchinas seva v'helam. So Beriyah is like Tohu, which is like the level of Arich, the lower level of Keser, which is Seviv, it surrounds, it's above, it hovers, transcendent the Helam, and it's concealed. And then will come a relatively a parenthesis, and then after the parentheses, Yetzirah b'chinas hagilu hu b'chinas alma diskasiv alma disgali. And Yetzirah is going to be the state of Gili, in contrast to Tohu of Beriyah. Okay. So I'm going to stop here, but this is where he's going to bring it now back to Beriyah and Yetzirah, which was the initial discussion that was ongoing earlier as he was moving from, as I said, Gemara and Mishnah, Talmud and Mishnah. So we'll stop here, page 1391, right by the parentheses, like 3/4 of the way down. Any questions?
I don't mean to sound irreverent here, but is this such a chiddush that the olam above and olam below it is more transcendent than the olam beneath it, which is more pnimi, is more revealed? I mean, this seems basic. I again, chas v'shalom, I'm not trying to be irreverent, but this seems kind of obvious.
Well, maybe what's basic to you is not so basic to me, frankly, but it's fine. What should I say? If it's that simple, great. I mean,
well, I'm just saying, many other places talk about moving from one world to the next is Ein Geder, Ein Arich, and the transcendent is obviously higher, and it's less revealed. It's more Ayin, and the world, the Mishtal to the next.
Look, if you understand it very clearly, then God bless you. That's great. I'm not. What am I going to tell you?
Is this a new thing for you that you're just read?
A lot of new things, yeah.
So, Rabbi, is
the Rebbe Rashab is not coming to say that that Beriyah is higher than Yetzirah. We all know that. That's not
obviously, but the notion that it's transcendent, it's more makif, and the world below it is more pnimi.
That's also not what he's coming to say. He's coming to speak about the qualities of Gilui that come, even though it's a lower level. So even though you'd say Iggulim is higher than Yosher, but Yosher has something that Iggulim doesn't have. That's his main thing that he wants to say.
Does Beriyah of Tohu correspond?
One second, let me just, maybe, did you hear what I said? 1 second.
I heard what you said. Are you saying
that's his main thing that he wants to comment to say?
Because we can relate to it better, because there's something more to hold on to? Is that what you're saying?
No, because he said, because tachlis hakavana hu b'chinas hagilui, because the purpose is everything should come in a state of gilui. So even though a higher state is higher, but there's something about integration that Yetzirah does, or if you want, the Mishnah does, that a higher state doesn't have. So that's his main thing.
Like we learned all the time.
Additionally, even furthermore, once you get into the two levels of Keser and Tohu and Vohu, these are all things you're not going to find very often in Chassidus. So there's a lot of new things here, from my point of view, at least. I mean, if you're talking just in general, that idea that one level is higher than another, and even in a lower level, you can find something higher. Yeah, you'll find in many places. But this is a particular context here. This is all contextual with the theme of Ayin Beis and interface and how we access the Ayin and Chochma and Binah. In general terms, that levels that they come down, that there's something in a lower level that has a quality, I mean, that speaks in many places. That's true, but that's not what his main theme here is. Here he's talking Beriyah, Yetzirah, and the Ayin and the Efes. I mean, depends what you're talking. If you're talking about just general, yeah. I mean, if you're saying it's basic enough, then why is this not so clear to you, all these ideas?
No. The reason I asked
the basic principle here.
That's Dafka why I asked the question, because it can't be that that's the only point he's making, and you just clarified. That's why I asked the question, because
so the basic principle of higher and lower and yeah, but here there's all the development of the different details of this.
Okay, thank you.
Look, yesterday Eliezer asked the question: why if the Yesh has everything, why do we need the higher levels? So clearly, it's not so simple. You need both. You need Atzilus, and you need Beriyah, and you need Yetzirah, and you need Mikra and Mishnah and Talmud. So to me, that's the real discussion here. What each one contributes.
That's well said. Thank you.
Yeah, well, go ahead. Somebody else wanted to ask something.
Yeah, so when the Beriyah connected to Tohu, is that parallel that aspect of being within Chochma on that level, possibly? Does that make sense? I'm trying to make sense out of it. So in terms of what's concealed and what's revealed in that context.
Binah associates with the level of Tohu, with the level of Beriyah, with the level of the lower level of Keser. What are you asking? Which associates with which? Not clear what you're asking.
I don't know. I was thinking there was the concept before you were talking about that the level of Chochma, which was discussed earlier on, that's the level of Binah, which is closer to Chochma, meaning that question of like, literally, like you don't know what to ask, for example, but you have a semi idea of what it is.
Okay, so that's the point. Chochma would be beyond us altogether. It's like just a spark of an idea. Binah is beginning to develop it, but it still remains, as you just said, you know enough to ask.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to I'm trying to connect the dots. Thanks.
And that is similar to the level of Tohu, that something has emerged. There is a level of Tohu, but you don't know what it is.
Yep. Thank you.
And if you want to talk about it from the top down, we'll use a somewhat of facetious. How do you pronounce it? Facetious or facetious?
Facetious.
Facetious. Imaginary scene. So imagine you are able to be a witness. They call a fly in the wall, a witness to see how God is creating existence. And you're looking at how from Atzilus will become Beriyah. Literally how from an energy will become a seed, or how conception takes place, where the seed of the man fertilizes the egg of a woman and a cell is conceived, a birth, a conception. So if you're able to zoom in with a microscope, what happens when the ayin becomes a yesh? Obviously, it's a fascinating moment, because that's when like nothing comes something. When I say nothing, I don't mean nothing. I mean nothing similar So it's not like you're taking a seed and turning it into a tree. That's easier to understand because that you already have the seed. But you're turning a non-seed into a seed. So you're taking an energy, the divine consciousness of Atzilus, becoming the Yesh of Beriyah, or in microcosm, that would be the Nukud of Ayin of Chochma becoming the Yesh of Binah. So it doesn't happen, like he said, in one jump. It's a slow process. So the first step of the process is that Binah begins to emerge, and you start seeing that there's something there, but if you were watching it, you wouldn't know what it is. It'd be like a foreign thing. Because if you're familiar with the divine energy, all you know is what is Elikus. You don't relate to something that's not godly. So suddenly you're seeing something that's not godly because it's not of the same substance of Atzilus or Chochma, but also it's not yet shaped into something else that you could say, oh, this is a tree, this is a human being, this is a sky, this is an animal. So that's somewhat this level that we're describing, the earliest origins of conception. It begins, obviously, first from Keser to Chochma and Binah, but here's talking about Chochma to Binah, but in broader terms, that would be from Atzilus to Beriyah, or from the world before Tohu into Tohu, Efes to Tohu, which is already Ayin. And then it continues, Vayu, Yetzirah will give it shape, at least general shape, and then it will become in Asiya a finished product. That would be just another way of visualizing it, if you like. So we're right now zooming in exactly that. Rebbe Rashab is giving us, is really dissecting the anatomy of how Ayin becomes a Yesh. And that is, you're not going to find very often such detailed discussion about it. But this is ultimately coming to explain how, again, existence and the divine will meet. And Torah, in the context of Mishnah and Talmud and Mikra, that Torah is the interface that God gives us to be able to understand Him, but also we should relate to Him, but also recognize things that are beyond us, which is, again, this dance that we're discussing here. I hope that helped a bit more as well.
Rabbi, could you say that the me relates to the Talmud because you said it was a deeper kind of a thing? Is that a parallel that you could make, or am I totally off base?
No, you're not off base, because actually Binah, Beriyah, and Talmud is that level. That's Talmud. I mean, if you take a little leap, you could maybe say that when you're studying Talmud and you don't have answers to your questions, you only have questions because it's dark and you don't understand, you're actually accessing this level of me because you're trying to cut clarity in a place where there's no clarity. And that's why you have to go back to the origins. So it's the question, the me maybe is actually what leads us into higher levels of higher states of conscious and superconscious to be able to develop what the Talmud would ultimately be. Because when you learn Talmud, there's a lot of me going on. They're always asking, what is this? Who is this? What is this talking about? That's the process of Talmud, of trying to clarify that which the Mishnah says when you don't have the clarity. He doesn't say this explicitly, but now that you bring it up, you could perhaps relate it to that. Maybe. Yeah, that's good. That's a good correlation, actually. I like that question. I like that. Good.
Thank you.
Okay. So with that said, so we'll stop here. Any other questions or questions? We're done with the question.